She wasn't even mentioned. No name, no thank you. No goodbye. At her husband's funeral, his will was read like a final slap, everything to his brother. Not a cent to the woman who stood by him through his cancer, bankruptcy, and betrayal. Just as the lawyer snapped the will shut, the maid approached her in silence and slipped something into her hand. A second will, signed, dated, hidden. And what it revealed didn't just change who inherited the estate. It rewrote everything she thought she knew about her husband, the maid, and the night he died. And someone will do anything to keep it buried. The loudest betrayals leave no sound. The rain had been falling since dawn, soft at first, like a whisper no one wanted to hear. By noon, it drummed the chapel roof like 1,000 small fists. She stood at the back, not in black but deep navy, his favorite color, on her, watching the casket descend without flinching. No one looked back at her. They kept their eyes forward, on the polished box, on the priest, on the brother-in-law. Her hands stayed folded, the left thumb circling a small dent in her wedding ring, barely noticeable. But she knew every curve of it. She hadn't cried. Not when they called time of death. Not when they zipped the bag. Not now, when strangers wept for a man they thought they knew. The first flash of betrayal had come weeks before he died. Just a flicker. He'd begun to call her by her full name. No more darling, no more love, just Eleanor, like a formality. Like a distance carved by things she couldn't see. He'd turned his face away when she kissed his forehead. Sighed he was just tired. Always tired. Now, in the silence after the ceremony, the will was read in the family sitting room. Leather-bound, fire crackling. She sat on the edge of a velvet chair that smelled of cigar smoke and mothballs. Her dress was still damp at the hem. To my brother, Thomas. The lawyer's voice floated, detached, as though even he didn't believe it. Full ownership of the estate, liquid assets. Business shares. No mention of her. Not once. No gratitude, no farewell, not even a gesture of decency. Her spine stayed straight. The room did not. The floor seemed to tilt, subtly. A low hum pressed into her ears. The kind you get in elevators or dreams. Thomas looked at her only once. Quickly, not triumph, not guilt. Something quieter, relief. As though the weight of pretending had finally lifted. As though this was always going to happen. She remembered the last dinner before the diagnosis. Candlelight. A chipped wine glass she kept meaning to replace. He'd laughed that night, touching her wrist lightly as she passed the salt. That was the last time she remembered his touch. And yet, now he was gone, and the world he left behind had erased her like a smudge on glass. But grief has teeth. And she had never learned how to scream. One by one, they left. Murmured condolences that slid off her like mist. The rain had stopped, but the window still wept. She remained seated. Only the maid lingered. Young, with wrists too thin for the heavy tray she always carried. Her eyes darted, then steadied. She stepped forward as the room emptied, one trembling hand behind her back. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Eleanor didn't respond. Not with words. The maid placed something in her palm. Paper, soft from being held too long, folded in quarters. No seal. The girl looked at her, eyes shining, then turned and vanished through the side door. Eleanor unfolded it slowly. Her breath caught her name, in his handwriting. No address. Just, "If you're reading this, then I failed you." The kind that changes weather in the bones. The ink bled slightly on the corners. Not from rain. From sweat, maybe. Fear. But the photo hid something worse. Folded inside the letter was a snapshot. A hallway she didn't recognize. A woman she did. Her. But blurred. As if captured in motion, her back turned. Her hand gripping a doorframe. And behind her, a shape. A man she thought long dead. Her husband, still alive at least when the photo was taken. The letter said more, but the words swam. The fireplace crackled behind her, hungry. The last line read, "Trust the wrong silence, and it will bury you." Her hands began to shake. Finally, in the hallway, she heard Thomas's voice, speaking softly to someone, laughing. Then it faded. Flashback, 2 weeks before the funeral. She'd walked in on a hushed conversation between the brothers. Her name stopped them mid-sentence. She hadn't asked. She should have. He had been different since that night. Distant, cold. As though something inside him recoiled from her. She'd blamed a cancer. The weight of dying. But dying doesn't need conspiracy. She placed the letter against her chest. Felt the pulse beneath it. Outside, the rain began again. Not soft this time. Wild. As if the sky had heard a secret it couldn't bear. The maid was gone. The envelope trembled on her lap. Eleanor stood slowly, crossed to the fire. The will still lay on the desk. Neat, untouched. She didn't touch it. Instead, she looked at the brass figurine on the mantel, an old bird sculpture, wings spread, a gift from her husband. Or so she thought. Now she wondered if he'd ever truly chosen it. If it was always meant to decorate her room, she'd be erased. She pressed the figurine's wing. Nothing. Then again. A click. A hollow knock. She tilted it forward. A compartment. Small. Hidden. Inside. A USB. Blue plastic. Scratched. She didn't plug it in. Not yet. Not with Thomas still in the house. But her breath came shallow now. Like she'd been running for hours and only just realized. He hadn't left her nothing. He left her the truth. But truth is colder than a grave. She took one last glance. At the will, not a single line for her, not a mention. Not even a lie. And then she saw it. In the corner of the parchment. A faint smudge. Lipstick. Not hers. A soft pink. The same shade Thomas's secretary wore. Reversal. Swift as heartbreak. She almost smiled. Almost. Down the hall. She heard Thomas's voice rise in argument, then calm. Always that pattern. Rage, then charm. The same dance. She held the USB tighter. He'd taken everything. But he hadn't taken her name. She walked up the stairs, letter still in hand. Every step a question. Every creak, an answer. At the top, she paused at the bedroom door. The one they used to share. The one that had become a museum of absence. She opened the drawer of his knitstand. Empty. Except for one thing. A torn receipt from a hotel. Dated 3 months ago. Room for 2. Not her. She sat on the bed and closed her eyes. Not to sleep. 2. Remember, the way he used to say goodnight. The scent of his aftershave. The silence that had crept in like a thief. The finality in Thomas's eyes when the will was read. No hesitation. No grief. Only the comfort of cruelty. Passed off as family. Duty. But she wasn't done yet. If justice still matters. You'll want the next page. A knock at the door. Soft. As if whoever stood there feared. Waking something not meant to stir. She didn't move. The letter. The USB. The photo. The lipstick. The room pulsed with them now. Another knock. And still. She did not answer. She stared ahead. Her reflection faint in the rain-streaked glass. Behind her, the door opened slowly, and all she said without turning was, "Which lie do you want me to believe?" Truth is rarely kind when it arrives late. He had touched her hand that day, not like a husband, but like a man trying to remember if softness had ever mattered. They were sitting beneath the old elm in the garden. Autumn leaves fell like burnt pages around them. He looked tired, yes, but something else had hollowed his voice. "I should have told you more," he'd said. That was the last time he spoke to her like he hadn't already left. Now the letter lay on the desk between them. Its paper uneven. Ink slightly faded. The date written with a shaky hand. 7 days before he died. This will bore her name. Her name. Not as an afterthought. As the rightful heir. Eleanor didn't speak as her lawyer turned it over, eyes scanning, brow tightening. He checked the first will again, the one read aloud in the sitting room. The one that had cut her out cleanly, surgically, like an old wound. Excised from the body of his legacy. This changes everything, he whispered. And yet something in his voice said it wasn't relief. It was warning. The second will named her as the primary beneficiary, not Thomas, not the business, not the charity fund Thomas chaired. It even mentioned the elm tree where they'd last sat, but the photo hid something worse. She remembered the photo from the enveloper, back to the lens, the blurred outline of a man who should have been too weak to stand, a man who was supposed to be dying, but was very much alive in that frame. The maid stood in the doorway, her apron still on, her fingers knotted at the hem. "I found it under the floorboard," she said quietly. In the old study, it was wrapped in plastic. Like someone wanted it safe, but not found. Eleanor's heart didn't beat harder. It beat slower, colder, like her body was preparing for something long buried to rise. She thought of the hidden USB she hadn't dared plug in yet. Of the lipstick stain on the will. Of the hotel receipt in the knitstand. The patterns were there, she realized. Only the courage to connect them had been missing. Her lawyer cleared his throat. "You realize what this means," he said. "If this will is real, and I believe it is, you were deliberately erased, which means someone tampered, either with the documents or with your husband's wishes. And if it was both?" She asked. He didn't answer. In her chest something twisted. Not grief, not yet. Grief had shape. This had only shadows. The signature matched, but the date didn't. "It's a week before his death," she murmured. He wasn't lucid. "Then, at least, I thought." The lawyer looked away. "I've seen dying men sharper than blades in their final days. And I've seen perfectly healthy ones slip into fog. Depends on the weight they're carrying. Or the people they trust." Thomas had always been polite to her, never warm. His compliments came measured, like clock chimes, precise, practiced, empty. But after her husband grew ill, Thomas grew present, too present, bringing papers, managing calls, keeping visitors away, protecting him, he'd said. Now she wondered, from whom? The maid stepped forward. Her voice shook. "I didn't want to say it before. I thought I was imagining things. But the night before he died, Mr. Thomas was in the room with him, arguing, loud enough I heard it from the stairs." Eleanor's lips parted. He told him something like, "You had your chance to make this clean. Don't make me do it for you." I didn't want to listen. I swear I didn't. But the door slammed. And the next morning he was gone. "And you waited until now to say something?" The maid's eyes filled. "I was afraid." The lawyer stood. "This will, if we submit it, becomes public. It'll void the first. But we'll need to prove authenticity. And that means questioning everyone, including Thomas, including the medical staff. Maybe even the coroner. What are you trying not to say?" Eleanor asked that this could become dangerous, not just messy, violent. She looked down at the paper. Her name, again. And again, with love. With trust. "I don't want the money," she said. "I believe you," the lawyer said. "But people who took it think you do." She sat still for a long time. The rain had paused. Outside the window, the elm tree stood in silhouette. A single leaf clung to the branch, fluttering like it hadn't made up its mind whether to fall or hold on a little longer. "You don't have to decide today," her lawyer offered, "but some decisions rot when you wait too long." She ran her fingers over the will's edges. The same hands that had nursed her husband in the dark, bathed him, held his shoulder when he winced at stairs, kissed a forehead already cooling. How could love become evidence? She stood and crossed to the fireplace. The mantel still held the old bird figurine. Now that she knew about the USB hidden inside, it looked different, hollow, complicit. She thought of her husband's apology beneath the elm, I should have told you more. But telling and trusting are not the same. She opened the drawer beside the fireplace, found the hotel receipt again. Room 304, same room booked 3 times overlapping, the weeks of his supposed decline, and always with the same initials, T-R-H-E-R. Hands clenched. But then something cracked. Not outside, inside. A thought she hadn't allowed to finish before. What if he didn't betray her? What if he tried to stop it and failed? Echo motif, the cracked wine glass. She remembered it now. That night they laughed. The chipped rim. He'd stopped drinking after that, claimed he was too tired. But the bottle had vanished quickly. And the next day, he'd slept through everything. Had Thomas drugged him? Had he signed things without knowing? She wanted to scream. But all that came out was breath. Old breath. Widow breath. She turned back to the maid. Did he say anything else? Anything at all? The girl looked at her feet, then back up. Just one thing, before he went to bed. He said, I hope she doesn't forgive me. She deserves better than that. Silence fell. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that stands at the edge of something terrible and looks down. She stepped toward the window. The leaf was gone now. Blown into the dusk. If justice still matters, you'll want the next page. She placed the will into the envelope, sealed it with trembling fingers, and turned toward the door. Somewhere in the hallway, Thomas was likely already planning his next move, but he didn't know what she knew now. He didn't know she'd buried her husband. Now, she might have to exhume the truth. Truth is rarely kind when it arrives late. He'd touched her hair that day, gently, as if brushing through years instead of strands. It was the last clear memory she had of him. His voice was low, and his eyes blurred, but the words still made their way through the fog. I never wanted to leave it like this. She hadn't known what this meant then. Now the shape of it was crawling up her spine. The new will lay on the table between them, trembling from the fan's low hum. The paper was heavier than the first, more textured, like it had been handled with care or hidden too long. Eleanor stared at the date. 1 week before his death. 1 week before she was told he could barely speak. But here he was, signing his name in clean, deliberate script. A different will. One with her name written clearly twice. The maid stood by the doorway, arms crossed tightly, face pale as porcelain. It was under the floorboard, she said again, softer this time, like the words might disappear if she spoke them too loud. Wrapped in a dish towel, hidden with some photos and a key. A key! Eleanor hadn't asked what it unlocked. Not yet. Her hands were still steady, but her breath had started skipping, like her lungs were trying to outrun what her mind was catching. She traced her name with her fingertip. Eleanor Ward, not just wife, not a footnote. He had named her, given her the house, the accounts, the vineyard. And in the handwritten note attached, just one line, forgive me for not protecting this sooner. But the photo hid something. Worse, she hadn't told anyone about the photo yet. The one that came in the envelope from the maid. The blurred figure in the hallway. Her husband upright, mid-step, too alive for the version of events she'd been told. The date stamp was faint, but visible. 3 days before he died. 3 days before they said he couldn't walk. The lawyer leaned forward. If this is real, he said, the first will is void. And if it isn't, he paused, then someone forged his signature. But it doesn't look forged. I've seen his writing too many times. This one, it feels final. She looked out the window. The sky had turned that soft bruised violet it gets before rain. The same color as the sweater she'd worn the day they told her he was gone. She still hadn't washed it. It hung in the closet like silence. I don't want the money, she said. I believe you, the lawyer replied. But this isn't about what you want. It's about what he wanted and what someone didn't. Her eyes drifted to the small scar on her left wrist. A cooking accident, years ago. He'd kissed it after wrapping the bandage, told her she was always trying to do too much. It was nothing. But now she pressed it, like she could squeeze memory out of skin. She turned to the maid. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? I was scared," she said. "Mr. Thomas, he's not the kind of man you say no to." Thomas. The liar shifted. "If we file this, he'll fight it. You know that. And if I don't? Then your husband's last words mean nothing, and Thomas wins." The key didn't match anything in the house. The maid had tried every drawer, every closet. It wasn't for the wine cellar, or the desk, or the basement safe. Eleanor took it earlier and pressed it into her palm, now cold, ornate, almost ceremonial. Something about it felt older than the house, older than the lies. "You said there were photos?" she asked. The maid nodded, pulling a wrinkled envelope from her apron. Inside, black and white prints, like security footage. A hand slipping something under a door. A man's silhouette outside her husband's study at 2 a.m. The face was obscured. But the outline was familiar. "Thomas," she said. "Maybe." The maid whispered. No one had seen her husband the day before he died, except Thomas and a night nurse who left town the morning after. No forwarding address. No notice. The lawyer cleared his throat. "I've seen cases like this. Siblings cutting out spouses. It happens more than you'd think. But this one." He picked up the will. "This feels personal." She thought of the chipped wine glass again, the one her husband stopped using near the end. He said it cut his lip once, but there was no mark. She'd asked if he wanted her to throw it out. He shook his head. "Even broken things deserve to be chosen," he'd said. She hadn't understood what he meant. Now she wondered if he was talking about himself. The echo motif circled back, small things ignored until they swallowed the room. She stood slowly, walking to the fire. The mantel still held the brass bird, its wings outstretched, its eyes hollow. She twisted its head again, like before. Click. She pulled the USB from the compartment. Her fingers hesitated. "What's that?" the lawyer asked. "Something he left me. Something I haven't had the courage to see." The maid stepped back. "You think it's about him?" "I think it's about all of us," Eleanor said. She looked down at the will again. Her name inked, not typed. Her worth finally acknowledged. But not protected, not enforced, just a gesture. A whisper after the scream. Thomas had always been the clever one, the planner, the one who watched rooms like puzzles. But even he hadn't planned on the maid finding the floorboard, or her husband leaving breadcrumbs behind in dish towels and hollow birds. She turned to the lawyer. "If I challenge this, how far could Thomas go?" A pause. "He has power," he said. "And men like him don't like being questioned. Especially not by women they thought had lost everything." She nodded. The ink on the will was smudged, as if someone had tried to erase part of it, then stopped. A name was faint in the margin. Someone who'd witnessed it. Someone crossed out. She leaned in. "Do you see that?" The lawyer squinted. "D. Prescott." That was his old nurse, but she was dismissed months before. Eleanor stepped back, but she didn't leave town. "I saw her at the farmer's market last week." The room shifted. She might have seen something, the lawyer said, or signed. Something she wasn't supposed to. Outside, the sky cracked open. Rain fell, not gentle, but hard, like it had been holding back too long. She placed the USB in her pocket, folded the will, pressed the key against her wrist until it left a dent. She'd buried her husband. Now she might have to exhume the truth. When money speaks, silence follows. The first time David ever tried to buy the house, it was spring, years ago. The wisteria was in bloom, vines climbing the garden walls like hands that never learned to let go. Her husband had laughed, a low, tired sound, and said, "Over my dead body." Now David had exactly that. Eleanor stood in the front hall, the same hall where David had once kissed her cheek and called her sister. He hadn't looked. Her in the eye since the second will surfaced. Not when he served the first lawsuit. Not when her bank accounts froze. Not when the mortgage company called on a home that was supposed to be paid in full. Grief is a tide, but betrayal is a knife. And David knew how to twist it. She picked up the letter from the marble-top table. Legal language dressed as courtesy. You are in breach. You have 10 days to vacate. It was signed by someone she'd never met, but knew worked for David now. The ink hadn't dried before the house began to feel like a threat, but the photo hid something worse. She took the letter to the study, the room her husband once wrote poetry in. Back when they still believed in small, quiet futures, the walls still smelled faintly of cedar and ink. The fire hadn't been lit in weeks. She slid the letter beside the USB drive, the one she still hadn't opened. Her fingers hovered, but fear stopped her. Instead, she opened the drawer where her husband kept old receipts. Inside, one note, hastily folded. Don't let David sell the house. Promise me. The ink was smudged with something darker than water. She traced the last word. Promise. A word that means everything until it's broken. Outside, tires crunched on gravel. David. She heard him before she saw him, boots on old stone. Voice too loud for the silence of a morning house. He didn't knock. He never knocked. She opened the door anyway. He stood in the doorway, collar damp from rain, face calm, almost kind. The same expression he wore at her wedding. A smile that never reached his eyes. You've put yourself in a difficult position, he said. She said nothing. You should have let sleeping wills lie. She stepped aside, but didn't invite him in. Still he entered. Lawyers talk. He continued. Yours is ambitious, but ambition's expensive. She watched his eyes as they drifted across the room. To the mantel, the chair her husband used to read in. The scuff on the floor no one else would notice. I'm not after the house, he lied, but you want it. He smiled. What I want is to protect the family name. We don't need this going public. It already is. Not yet. He stepped closer. There was something brittle in his movements, like he was rehearsing calm. His hand twitched slightly. At his side, a tell. Her husband once told her David shook when nervous, but masked it with posture. It's not personal, he said. That's the most personal thing someone can say. A pause. I know he loved you. But he wasn't thinking straight at the end. Her throat clenched. Is that why you deleted the security footage? His mouth twitched. The day he died. The camera logs are missing. That was the system. He said, old tech, it breaks. She stepped forward. Except the maid saved a backup, a flash in his eyes. A second too fast. Then where is it? She hesitated. That was the wound. He was afraid, not of her. Not of lawyers, afraid of being seen. He'd spent his life hiding behind money, charm, and shadows. But tapes don't lie. Not if the maid still had them. She left town, Eleanor lied. Another twitch. A breath he didn't mean to show. She always was too curious, he said, quieter now. That kind of thing doesn't end well. She noticed the scar on his wrist, thin, recent, not healed. She looked at it. He followed her gaze and pulled his sleeve down too fast. It's nothing, he muttered. No one said it was. He turned toward the door. You have until Friday, he said. After that, you'll bury me too? He stopped, didn't turn. Then he left. The door shut with a softness that scared her more than any slam. She stood in the hallway. For a long time, the old chandelier above her creaked. Somewhere upstairs, a window thudded from wind. The house was speaking again. It always did when no one wanted to listen. She returned to the study. Sat at the desk. Pressed the USB into the port. Password required. Of course. She thought for a moment. Then typed :WISTERIA. Access granted. One video file. She didn't press play. Not yet. Instead, she picked up the letter from David's lawyer again. Beneath it, A photo, not the blurred one, a new one. Slipped under her door this morning. The maid. Smiling. Standing outside the train station. Time dash stamped. 2 days ago. But no return address. No note. Just the image, if she left town. Why was Eleanor the only one who knew? She glanced at the key the maid had given her. She still didn't know what it opened. But now she wondered if it wasn't for the house. Maybe it was for a locker. A safe deposit box. Or something buried. She pressed play on the video. Static. Then dash a hallway. Footsteps. A voice. Hers. And then silence. She paused the footage. Just before a shadow crossed the doorway, she rewound, froze it, frame by frame, and there a reflection in the glass. David. Holding something behind his back. A gesture she remembered. He did it when they were kids hiding. Birthday gifts or stolen things. Always in his left hand. Always slightly trembling. She closed the laptop. The room felt smaller now. If justice still matters, you'll want the next page. She picked up the photo of the maid. Traced the edge with her thumb. Then she saw a dot in the corner of the photo. A clock tower, but not from their town. She recognized it from a postcard. On her husband's desk, a place he used to go when he needed to think. And just like that, she knew where the maid had gone. But when she called her number, the line was dead. And then the maid disappeared. Some truths are filed away until they burn through the wood. She remembered the look on his face the night before, the fall eyes darting toward the stairwell like it had grown teeth. He had been shivering under 2 blankets, sweat slicking his temples. She asked if he wanted to call the doctor. He only whispered, "Someone's changing something." She'd thought he meant the weather. Now the study was quiet, too quiet. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt held, like the walls had memorized what she wasn't supposed to know. Eleanor stood in front of his desk, her fingers grazing the grain. There were no grand secrets on the surface. Just pens lined up in perfect rows, a notebook with half-written to-do lists, and a paperweight shaped like a raven, wings folded in. But grief rewired the eyes. What had once looked like order now looked like a crime scene. Cleaned too soon. Opened the top drawer. Invoices. Birthday cards. A letter to a friend that had never been mailed. The ink was blue and neat until it wasn't. Half a sentence trailed off mid-thought. "I think David." Then nothing. Just a small ripple in the paper, like a tear had dropped there. She opened the next drawer. Receipts. Prescriptions. 1. Bottle labeled Zorlax, a medication she didn't recognize. The date printed was 2 weeks before his fall. The name on the label was smudged, but she could make out the initials. D.W. David's name wasn't supposed to be on his meds. She looked. Again. A small notch in the wood at the back of the drawer. It wasn't new. She wouldn't have noticed it, but her finger caught the edge. Something scraped beneath. She pushed. A soft click. The drawer extended an inch farther. A panel lifted. A hidden compartment. And inside it, a stack of letters, bound with twine. Fragile as dried leaves, some addressed to her, some not addressed at all. The top one was dated 9 days before he died. She opened it slowly, as if the words might bleed if torn. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, I've failed to tell you in time. I've tried, God knows I've tried, but I don't know who to trust anymore. David is not who he says he is. I believe he's been changing my medications. I feel wrong. Not just sick, different, like someone else is moving my limbs. I hear whispers at night. I see him outside the door when he thinks I'm asleep. I caught him in the study once. He said he was looking for printer paper. He wasn't. I don't know if he wants the house, the business, or just to bury what I know. But if something happens," the ink paused. A shadow passed across the page. Then, smaller, "if I die, it won't be an accident." Her hands trembled. But the photo hid something worse. She dug further. More letters. One describing the pills tasting different. One about the nurse quitting suddenly. One marked, "Do not open unless I'm gone." She opened that one too. They will say it was the cancer. Or the stairs. Or that I just lost my mind. Maybe I did, near the end. But I need someone to see what I couldn't prove. There's a drawer in the guest room with old tapes. I kept one from the night before my fall. I haven't watched it yet. I'm afraid of what I'll see. But if I don't make it, please. Look. The drawer in the guest room had been empty when she checked last week. She remembered thinking it strange. The tapes used to be stacked high, gone now. Like someone cleared history. She pressed her hand to her chest. The raven paperweight tipped. Slightly on the desk, she adjusted it. That's when she noticed the back panel of the desk loose. Discolored, she knelt. Pulled it free. Another letter shorter. Sharper. It read only, "If I die, blame my brother." She sank to the floor, knees pressed to the cool wood. The room didn't feel like his anymore. It felt like his warning. She looked up at the bookshelves. So many bindings, so many spines. But now she couldn't remember which ones were his favorites, and which ones he placed there just to fill space. That was the cruelty of death. It blurred intention. She opened another letter. This one had her name on it 3 times. The last time, it was almost unreadable. A frantic scrawl. "Eleanor, don't trust anyone, especially him. I know how this sounds. But if you still love me," she folded the letter shut. She didn't need the rest. "If justice still matters, you'll want the next page." She sat back on her heels, breathing through her nose, as if to keep from making sound. The echo motif returned, his hand on the stair railing, his slow descent. The moment he paused, the glance over his shoulder like he heard something. That glance was the last thing the security camera caught. She went to the guest room, searched again, every drawer, every shelf, behind the frame, under the rug. Nothing. She returned to the study, checked the letters again. In one, he had written, "You'll know if you're close to the truth, because David will start getting loud," and he had. The lawsuits, the threats, the closed accounts. It wasn't a war, it was panic, dressed as power. The final letter was unsigned, but it smelled like his cologne. The drawer didn't close all the way now. She left it that way. Some things should stay open. The wind outside picked up. The curtains swayed. A picture frame tilted on the wall. She didn't fix it. Instead, she took the letters and placed them inside the raven paperweight's hollow. Not for hiding, but for safekeeping. She'd dig deeper tomorrow. Tonight, she would sit in his chair. Let the wood remember him, and let the letter echo through her ribs. "If I die, blame my brother." The help sees what the family ignores. Before she was a maid, Lena worked in a school cafeteria, silent hands serving spoiled children. She learned quickly, it wasn't the screams or tantrums that told you who had power. It was who cleaned up the mess afterward. The church shelter smelled of bleach and broth. A crucifix hung above the cot where Lena sat, back rigid, hands folded, like she was still holding a tray. Eleanor hadn't seen her in over a week, not since the morning she slipped her the envelope. That morning, Lena's hands had trembled like a frightened animal's. Now, they were still, tense. She didn't speak at first. Just looked at Eleanor with something more haunted than guilt. "I didn't run," she said, voice flat. "I hid." Eleanor sat across from her. The cot creaked beneath the weight of unspoken things. "Why here?" Eleanor asked. "Because God forgets faces, but men don't." The photo hid something worse. The stained glass window behind Lena glowed red and gold as light shifted. It painted her face like fire, like confession. "I didn't steal anything," Lena said. "I saved it." Eleanor didn't speak. Just waited. Lena swallowed. "I knew something was wrong. I knew it long before he fell." He started locking the study again, and not just at night. Eleanor felt her pulse tighten. He was scared, Lena said, but not of dying. Of being silenced. What did he tell you? Lena's gaze flicked toward the crucifix, that he was writing a second will, and that I should keep it safe. Eleanor's voice cracked. Why you? Because I wasn't family. He said, they don't see you. That makes you safer. The words hit her like a bruise. Lena reached into her coat, pulled out a small metal key brass hold. She placed it between them like a weapon. This was taped under the drawer. The night he died, I found the safe. Open. The will was gone. Eleanor's breath caught. I found ash in the fireplace. Not all of it burned. She pulled out a small Ziploc bag. Inside, blackened paper. And in one corner, half a signature. His, I kept what I could. The rest, Lena looked away. He almost found me. David? Lena nodded. He came back that night, after the ambulance left. Thought he'd forgotten something. But he didn't go upstairs. He went straight to the study. Eleanor's mouth went dry. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Because I saw what happened to him. Her voice shook now. And I knew I'd be next. You weren't. Paranoid. No, Lena said, but I was a coward. She looked down at her palms. I saw the file. The one with all the numbers. Bank accounts, wire transfers, some of them in your name. But you never signed them. What? He was. Using your identity, she whispered, to cover his tracks. Eleanor felt something break inside her. Not cleanly. Like ice beneath pressure. He was planning to go public, Lena said. Your husband. He told me if anything happened to him, the will would speak louder than his voice. He never told me, Eleanor whispered, because he loved you. And because he knew he didn't have much time. The church bell rang outside, 3 soft chimes. Lena flinched. I've been followed, she said. I know it. But I waited because you needed to hear this before it was too late. Eleanor reached forward, took Lena's hand. It was colder than the metal bench beneath them. I can protect you, Eleanor said. No, Lena said. You can't. She pulled something else from her coat. A torn page-lined paper, faded blue ink. It was unmistakably his handwriting. Eleanor read, if you're reading this, it means the will didn't make it, but someone did. Someone who was willing to risk everything. Someone you should trust, more than family. The words blurred behind. Her eyes, he left more, Lena said, but not with me. What do you mean? The locker, at the station. The one he used to visit when he needed air. There's a box there. He told me once, if anything ever happened, go there. But the key is in the paperweight, Lena said, almost smiling. The raven. I saw him hide it once. You always thought it was decorative. But he believed symbols could speak when mouths couldn't. The raven dot, it always sat on his desk. A gift. She thought it meant poetry, but it meant survival. She remembered David's hand on the fireplace poker that night. The grip wasn't to steady himself, it was to swing. I should leave now, Lena said. I've stayed too long. Wait, but Lena stood. If he finds me again, he won't. Let me talk twice. Where will you go? Lena looked up at the stained glass Christ, face cracked through the center, somewhere without mirrors. Why? Because I still see it. The moment he realized the will was gone. Eleanor stood too. Why did you save it? Lena's lips parted, but no answer came. Then because he was kind. And because no one believed me when I said I mattered until he did. Silence, not heavy. Just final. She pressed the torn signature into Eleanor's palm. Prove it mattered, she said. Then she walked out, coat flapping like wings. Eleanor stood alone in the makeshift chapel, surrounded by fading saints and flickering candles. Outside, rain tapped against stained glass like soft knuckles. She'd risked her life for that will, but who else was willing to kill for it? Children draw what adults hide. He had shouted so loud, even the roses flinched. It was 3 days before the fall. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, icing a cake that no one would finish, when she heard the argument crack the garden's peace. Through the glass, she saw her husband gripping the patio rail, David inches from his face. A hard jab of the finger. A word she couldn't hear but still felt. Lily was in the yard too, sitting quietly on the stone edge of the fountain, watching them like a child might watch thunder. Now, in the soft hush of the living room, Lily's crayons whispered across the page, the scent of vanilla from the cupcake candle mixed with dust and something older lavender, maybe from a life when things were still soft. Lily was on the floor, her legs tucked underneath her like folded cloth, drawing in that same spiral-bound sketchpad she'd carried to every sleepover since preschool. Eleanor watched her from the couch, still in her widow's black. Not because of mourning, but because wearing anything else felt like forgetting. "Who's that?" Eleanor asked, nodding to the sketch. Lily didn't look up. "That's Grandpa. And that's Uncle David." "And what are they doing?" She paused. "Fighting." Eleanor's throat tightened. "And this?" She pointed to the figure on the stairs. "That's me," Lily said. "Hiding." The little figure in the corner had no face, just wide circles for eyes. Eleanor took the pad gently and brought it into her lap. Her fingers brushed the waxy crayon strokes. In the picture, her husband stood at the top of the staircase. David was behind him, arms out, not catching, pushing. The figure's hands were drawn in motion, angled forward. It wasn't a fall. It was force. "Lily," she said, trying to sound calm, "why did you draw it like this?" "Because that's what happened." Silence bloomed like mold. Eleanor looked up. Lily was already busy with another page. Drawing. A cat now carefree. "Sweetheart. No one ever told you that, did they?" "No." "Then how do you know?" "Because I saw it," Lily said. "I was going to ask Grandpa to help me with my spelling, but the door was open a little, so I just peeked. I saw him yell. Then I saw Uncle David push, and then Grandpa was gone." The child's voice didn't break, but Eleanor did. Tears came in short, angry jolts. She pressed her fingers to her temples. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "They said it was an accident. And I thought maybe I imagined it, but I didn't." No, she hadn't. The photo hid something worse. "Does your mother know?" Lily shrugged. "She doesn't listen." Eleanor almost laughed, bitter and broken. Out of all the voices in the house, it was the smallest one that held the key. Not the lawyers, not the maids, not even her own trembling suspicion. A child, bearing the truth like a drawing tucked behind. Fridge magnets. What does this mean? She whispered to herself. What do I even do with this? If someone lies, you tell, Lily said simply. It wasn't simple, of course. Not anymore. Not when the man in the drawing controlled everything from the will to the air she breathed. But Lily wasn't wrong. If justice still matters, you'll want the next page. She stood and crossed the room to the cabinet. Inside, a small leather box, her husband's cufflinks, old receipts, a rusted key. She opened the lid and placed Lily's drawing inside. The paper didn't belong in a gallery. It belonged in a courtroom. But the weight of that reality hung heavy. Because a child's testimony could be discredited, brushed off as imagination. And David would scorch the earth to protect himself. She sat again. Lily, she said, steady now. Do you remember anything else? The girl nodded. Uncle David saw me, after. I think he knew I was watching. Eleanor froze. What did he do? He smiled. But not like a happy smile. She remembered that same smile at the funeral when he placed his hand on her back and whispered, "You're not alone." He had known even then that someone had seen. That smile had always unsettled her. Now she understood why. It wasn't grief. It was victory. Lily handed her another page. I drew this one last week, but Mommy didn't look. It was a garden. The birthday cake. The family smiling. But in the corner, under the tree's shadow, David's eyes. 2 black dots, sharp and separate from the rest. Eleanor smoothed the page, her fingers trembling. "Do you want to tell someone else about this?" she asked. "Will they believe me?" A pause. Eleanor knelt in front of her. "They will when I stand beside you." The room stilled. Outside, wind lifted the curtains, brief, like breath. David's betrayal wasn't just paper deep. It had muscle. He had power. But power built on silence could be shattered by one brave sound, she remembered. Her husband's voice, just before the fall. A soft apology. "I should have protected you better." She thought he meant from death. Now, she wondered if he meant from what would come after. She touched Lily's cheek. "You're very brave, you know. I didn't do anything." "You saw," Eleanor said. "That's everything." A storm was coming. Papers, lawyers, possibly blood. But now she had more than whispers. She had a witness. A girl too small to carry it, and too strong to ignore it. She picked up the drawing again. The crayon was pressed deep into the paper. You could feel the anger even through the wax. The push was not an accident. The body falling was not clumsy. One small drawing could bring down a dynasty. Proof doesn't disappear, it's hidden. It was almost midnight when Eleanor returned to the house she no longer called home. The light in the foyer was still out, the bulb never replaced since the funeral. Shadows fell long and sharp across the stairs, the same stairs that had taken him. She stood in the silence, holding the envelope Lena had passed her in the alley, its edges damp from rain and worry. Inside was the tape, the backup security footage. The one everyone thought had been erased. She didn't take off her coat, didn't sit. She moved like someone on borrowed time. The old DVD player groaned as it powered on. The flat screen flickered to life. No menu, no sound. Just grainy black and white timestamps blinking in the corner. She pressed play. The first few frames were empty. The foyer still and dull. Then, 11:47 p.m., the door opened. David. He walked in without knocking. No hesitation. No glance at the camera he didn't know existed. His jacket was buttoned. His shoes left a trail across the wet tile. He stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, then turned down the hallway toward the study. She remembered the night now. How the wind had howled so loudly she thought it was grief knocking. But it was him. At 1:52 a.m., the door opened again. David stepped out. Alone. He looked up, straight into the lens, as if daring the house to remember. Eleanor paused the tape. The fall happened at 5:17 m. Her husband's body had been found twisted at the foot of the stairs, neck bent, hands still, reaching towards something. But David had left hours earlier. The timeline didn't make sense, unless someone else had stayed behind, unless someone else had helped. She rewound the tape, played it again. Slower. She watched David disappear into the study, and moments later a flicker. A shape moving behind the curtains. The camera didn't catch faces, just motion. Just breath caught on screen. Someone had been inside already, and they hadn't left with David. She leaned closer, breath fogging the screen. In the far corner, barely visible, a second shadow, not large, not loud, just present. The photo hid something worse. She felt her heart thud once, heavy and uneven. This wasn't just greed. It was orchestration. She reached for the torn piece of notepaper she kept in her pocket, her husband's handwriting, faded but undeniable. 6 words. "If I die, blame my brother." But what if he hadn't written it all? What if someone else had held the pen? She closed her eyes. The last time she saw him alive, he had looked exhausted. Not just physically, but emptied. Like a man who had already buried a truth he couldn't name. He had kissed her hand, not her lips, and whispered, "Be careful. The house has ears." At the time she thought he was confused. Now she knew better. Someone had been in the walls, behind the doors, in the room when the will was burned. The maid had risked everything to keep the tape. But even Lena didn't know this, the presence in the dark, the second silence. She rewound again, played it in reverse. At 12:33 a.m., the curtain twitched, but there was no wind. She grabbed the remote. Paused. She could see it now, part of a sleeve, not David's. Lighter, and the hand that reached for the curtain rod wore a ring. Her breath caught. There was only one other person in the family who wore a band like that. Her sister-in-law, Margot, the woman who cried loudest at the funeral. The one who'd poured the wine at dinner the night before. The one who had always said, "This house was never meant for you." It couldn't be, but it was. She moved back to the player and took the disc out, hands shaking. Slipped it into the envelope. She would need a second copy. She would need witnesses. And soon. Because this wasn't a murder. It was a cover-up. And the will was just the surface. If justice still matters. You'll want the next page. She walked to the study. The raven paperweight still sat where it always had. A symbol of poetry. Death, or maybe just watchfulness. She turned it over. The latch gave way with a click. Inside. A small silver flash drive. She hadn't noticed it before. She inserted it into her laptop, afraid of what silence might break. Inside one file. Labeled for E. She clicked. His voice filled the room. "Darling, if you're hearing this, I didn't make it. And if I didn't, it wasn't an accident. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you." She couldn't breathe. There's more than one enemy in this house. More than one hand on the knife. I don't know how deep it goes. But follow the paper trail, not the people. Paper doesn't lie. A rustle, a cough. And then, David wasn't alone. The audio clicked off. No more. Just static. She closed the laptop, hands over her mouth. Her world had been reduced to secrets. But not just between brothers. Someone had let him die. Someone had stayed behind. And now, they knew she was watching. There was someone else in the house. Confrontation reveals character. The reading room had always been too quiet. Heavy velvet curtains dulled even the sound of breath. Books stood like silent jurors, lined wall to wall. Eleanor had dusted them herself once, back when silence meant peace, not proof. Now silence was the enemy. She sat at the far end of the long oak table, the same one where her husband used to rest his hands while reviewing contracts and letters. His ghost seemed etched into the grain, a faint imprint of a man who had once believed his home would outlive him. She touched the edge of the chair he used, then drew back her hand. Across from her, David slouched with the casual defiance of a man cornered but not yet caged. His cufflinks were silver skulls, too obvious, too loud. He was never subtle. That had always been his weakness. Beside him, his wife Margot kept her lips thin, her eyes darting. She smelled like Lily, an expensive fear. Lena stood just behind Eleanor, holding her purse tight to her chest like a shield. The child Lily sat on the floor near the fireplace, coloring in silence. Crayon marks bled thick across the paper red. Unread, the lawyer Mr. Den stood by the player. He was calm, older, voice lined with caution. "We'll begin with the footage," he said. Eleanor nodded once. The video played. David entered. Midnight timestamp. The same clip she'd watched alone. The room darkened as everyone leaned in. Lily looked up for the first time. "That's when he took the keys," she said softly. No one answered her. David scoffed. "This is fabricated." But on the screen, he stared straight at the camera like a man who knew where the lens was hidden. Mr. Dens didn't flinch. "Timestamp is intact. This footage came from a backup archive. Your own security system." Then the system was tampered with. David sat forward now. "You know how easy it is to edit that sort of thing. You think this proves anything?" Lena spoke. Quiet. "You didn't expect the maid to know how to back up data." He turned. On her, voice slicing. "You were paid well. This is how you repay loyalty." She said nothing. Just unzipped her purse and pulled out a phone. A voicemail was queued up. Unplayed. Her fingers trembled as she set it on the table. I saved this, she whispered, because I knew fear when I heard it. She pressed play. David's voice, harsh and frantic, filled the room. He's not changing it back, I told him. I warned him. If he keeps the second will, he's asking for trouble. This isn't just about money, it's about principle. He betrayed blood. A pause. Then, if he dies looking the wrong way, that's on him. Lily's crayon snapped in her hand. The room collapsed into stillness. David's mouth opened. But no sound came. It was Margot who spoke. That's taken out of context. Eleanor stood slowly. There's only one context I care about. The moment my husband begged for help and you all turned away. She pulled from her coat the final envelope, torn at the edge. Inside, the letter with her name in his handwriting. It trembled in her hand. He wrote me the night before, said he was scared. Said someone was inside the walls. The bookshelves seemed to close in. She placed the letter on the table, next to the phone. David shook his head, but he was paler now. Less fire, more ash. Eleanor walked toward Lily and knelt beside her. Sweetheart, may I see what you drew? The child hesitated, then held up the picture. A staircase. A man falling. Another man standing at the top. And behind him, a third figure. A woman, half hidden. Eleanor's breath caught. The color of the dress was unmistakable. Plum silk, Margot's favorite. The photo hid something worse. Children draw what adults hide. Eleanor murmured. Margot took one step back. You think you'll get justice through crayon and coincidence? David growled, but his voice had changed. Less rage, more dread. Mr. Dens folded his arms. Combined with the tape and voicemail, a judge might think otherwise. I didn't touch him, David snapped. I only warned him. And Margot? Eleanor asked, her eyes hardening. Margot's voice cracked for the first time. I didn't mean for him to fall. I just wanted him to listen. Just once. Eleanor turned to her. And he did, that night. He told me not to be afraid. That he was finally going to tell the truth. The room was trembling now, not from movement, but from revelation. Lena placed her hand over Eleanor's on the table. There's still more, she said softly. Something you need to see. She pulled from her pocket a flash drive. No more recordings. David snapped. It's not a recording, Lena said. It's a scan of the first will, the real one. The ink was lifted and replaced. He didn't sign the new one. He signed a blank page. You switched the sheets, didn't you? David's silence was his answer. Pride, smallness. Eleanor's voice was barely above breath. You couldn't let him leave it to me, because if I had the house, I'd have the memory. And you couldn't bear being forgotten. David looked up, no longer furious. Just exposed. Do you know what it was like? He said quietly. To be the brother who never measured up? He gave you everything, and I got dust. You were the wife, but I was the ghost. Always watching. Eleanor stepped forward. Then you should have stayed a ghost. Mr. Dens clicked the player off. We'll be filing today. Margot turned toward David. You said it would be clean, quiet. Lena touched Lily's shoulder and guided her out of the room. Eleanor remained, looking at the chair where her husband used to sit. The indent still faint in the cushion. The scent of old cedar and lemon oil. She imagined him there. Still holding the truth. Like a match, she ran her fingers along the edge of the table stained by time. Bloodless but bruised. I warned him to change it back. He didn't listen. Dead men don't speak unless we let them. The courtroom smelled of varnish and sweat. Too many breaths held, too many eyes waiting for a past to collapse into sentence. Eleanor sat at the front, back straight, hands folded like a prayer she hadn't said in weeks. She hadn't worn black today, just charcoal gray. The color of fog before it becomes storm. David sat across from her, shackled in expression more than wrists. His suit hung loose on him, now shoulders. Hunched, pride bled out. He didn't meet her gaze. Not once. He stared at the judge like salvation might be hiding in the gavel. But salvation, today, belonged to ghosts. The bailiff called the last exhibit. A worn piece of paper, unfolded slowly, its creases like old wounds. The second will. Signed. Dated. Witness. The courtroom. Hush. A name. Her name. The rightful beneficiary. Everything else had been noise. This was his final word. The judge's voice was even as iron. This document is valid and legally binding. We rule in favor of the petitioner. Eleanor didn't breathe. Not right away. Justice sounded nothing like thunder. It was a whisper dragged through broken glass. There was a pause, the kind that ripples louder than verdicts. David stood slowly. A marshal approached. The cuffs clicked. Eleanor turned to watch, but not with vengeance. Just exhaustion. Because grief wasn't erased by justice. It simply had somewhere to sit now. David's lawyer murmured something. Something about financial fraud, falsified records, tampering with property. But Eleanor only heard the echo of a night her husband had tried to rewrite their ending. She could still see him, sitting at his desk, slouched in his sweater, hands ink-stained, light dim. Writing the second will, not with anger, but ache. This time, he had whispered, "I'll get it right." She hadn't asked what that meant. She wished she had. David passed her on his way out. Eyes down, but his mouth twitched, something between a grimace and guilt, and maybe, buried beneath his ruin, there was still a boy who only ever wanted to be enough. Pride, smallness, that was the wound beneath his cruelty. Not power, not money, just absence. Back at home, the storm had passed. Rain slicked the windows, but inside the house, it was warm. Eleanor walked room to room in her socks. She didn't need noise. She needed proof she could still hear the house breathing. The last box remained in the study. She opened it. Inside, her husband's cufflinks. Not gold, not ornate. Just brushed silver, etched with their initials. She ran her thumb across them and held them to her chest. On the bottom of the box, folded once, was a photo. She hadn't seen it before. Her husband, younger, laughing. David beside him, grinning too wide. Margot in the background, not smiling but present, and her at the edge, holding a wine glass, pregnant with their son. But the photo hid something worse. Tucked behind the frame was a receipt for medication. Dated the week before the fall. Prescribed double the usual dosage. Initialed not by the doctor, but by someone else. Margot's handwriting. She folded it slowly, placed it in a drawer. Not revenge. Just remembrance, because some betrayals didn't need to scream. They hummed, low and steady, until the silence broke. Lily found her in the garden later. "Grandma," she said, "is the house safe now?" Eleanor knelt. "It is. Even the stairs?" "Especially the stairs." She kissed the girl's forehead and handed her a daisy. Lily tucked it behind her ear and ran to the fountain. The statue there had always unnerved Eleanor. Two angels, one weeping, one watching. She had once thought they represented grief and memory. But today, she realized, one was mourning the truth. The other had waited for it. Lena joined her on the bench. "No press outside," she said. "They'll come back." Lena nodded. "Will you keep the house?" "For now," Eleanor said. "Until it forgets the scream. Grief doesn't leave. It takes a seat and watches who's left standing." Inside, the lights flickered. Not from power, but from timing. Old homes held grudges. She walked back into the study. One last time. Her fingers drifted to the switchplate, behind which the first will had once been hidden. She opened it. Nothing now, just dust and air that remembered lies. But as she closed it, she noticed something else, etched faintly into the paint. A single word. Sorry. Not her husband's handwriting. David's, perhaps scrawled in a moment of weakness, or too much wine. Or A. Second, where guilt cracked through ego. She ran her thumb over it. Dead men don't speak, unless we let them. Justice signed its name in ink and grief. Grief is heavier when shared with ghosts. The keys were cold in her hand. The front door. Stuck just like always, but this time, no one came to pull it open from the inside with a half smile and a line about the weather. Just her, the door, and whatever remained of memory behind it. The house did not welcome her. It braced. Dust rode the sunlight in lazy spirals, and the silence felt stretched too thin. Like skin healing over something still infected, she stepped. Over the threshold slowly, her shoes whispering against wood that hadn't been polished since the funeral. The scent of old varnish and dried roses clung to the air, stubborn as truth. Upstairs, she didn't go yet. She wasn't ready. She dropped. Her coat over the same arm of the velvet chair where he always left his briefcase. The cushion still sagged there. Her fingers skinned the edge. Of the grand piano closed now. Silent. She hadn't played since the will was read. That morning played again in her mind. David's face white as paper. Her lawyer whispering, "We won, but this doesn't mean it's over." But it had to be. She couldn't fight the dead, and she couldn't keep grieving the living dot in the corner of the sitting room. A single voicemail light blinked red. 7 unheard messages. 6 were nothing junk. Calls from lawyers, condolences from strangers. Who didn't know how he took his tea? But the last one was dated 6 days before he died. She sat down before she pressed play. It crackled at first. Then his voice, thinner than she remembered. "I don't know if you'll ever hear this. I messed things up, Al, not the money. Not the house, you. I didn't love well, but I loved you most." Some truths arrived too late. And still they split the air like thunder. The message ended with the soft click of a man who still thought he had time. She set the phone down gently, like it might bruise. Upstairs, the door to the master bedroom was half open. She hadn't been in there since the coroner left, but grief was like water. It always found its way through cracks. She went in. The bed had been made by someone else. Tighter corners, fewer pillows. All the comfort stripped clean. She opened the window, let in the breeze. In the closet, his things were still there. Pressed suits, ties, lined like soldiers who lost the war. And the shoebox. The one he kept tucked in the back, behind the winter coats. Inside, old Polaroids, faded love letters, the receipt from the motel where they spent their 5th anniversary, the one they swore they'd never tell anyone about because the ceiling leaked, and they laughed until they cried. And one envelope, addressed to her in his handwriting. She didn't open it, not yet. She just held it against her chest and let the weight of it settle in her ribs. The photo hid something worse. Behind the pictures, folded 3 times and yellowing, was the blueprint of the house. A hand-drawn note. Circled a space behind the fireplace. She went back downstairs, pulled the andiron to the side. Tapped her hand along the bricks until one gave slightly. Behind it, a hollow, inside, a key. And a flash drive. She didn't plug it in yet. Just held it, palm up, like something both sacred and cursed. Sometimes secrets weren't buried to stay hidden. They were buried to wait. The afternoon waned, the sun hanging low. She opened all the windows, let the past out. Later, in the kitchen, she made tea. The mug she used had a crack running down the side. One she always meant to throw away. But she didn't, because some things are meant to break and still be held. She sat at the table where they'd once argued about paint colors, where he used to leave her sticky notes folded into cranes. She unfolded one she'd saved. Still in the drawer. It read, "If we lose everything, we still have this." It didn't say what this was, but maybe it was the sound of the kettle, whistling at dusk. Or the way the wind caught the lace curtains. Just so. Or the house itself. Even cracked, it still stood. The next morning, she called the contractor. Told him to start with the garden wall. The ivy had swallowed too much. He asked if she'd sell. No, she said. It's time this house remembered who it belonged to. Retaining wall first, then the studio. Then the stair rail that had splintered near the top dot she didn't need it to be perfect. She just needed it to breathe. Healing doesn't announce itself. It knocks softly, then asks if it can stay a while. Weeks passed. Boxes unpacked, closets cleared. Old photos framed. One night she lit a candle on the piano. She didn't play. Just sat there, letting the light flicker across the keys like fingerprints. A note tucked beneath the music stand caught her eye. It was in his handwriting. A line from an old song they used to slow dance to in the hallway when they were young. And dumb and full of what-ifs. Home is where the forgetting stops. She closed her eyes. Outside, wind chimes swayed gently. The daisy Lily had picked weeks ago, now dried and brittle, still sat in the WINDOWS ILL. And behind her, faintly, voicemail echoed in her mind. I didn't love well, but I loved you most. She waited, and now she rebuilds. Some debts can't be repaid, but they can be honored. The first time she saw the maid cry, it wasn't over the death, it was over a chipped teacup. The widow had come into the kitchen, barefoot, the morning after the funeral, rain still tapping the windows, the scent of lily and soil still heavy in the foyer. And there, in the sink, the cup sat in two neat pieces, bone china, pale blue. From a set that hadn't been touched in years, the maid mirror stood beside it, shoulders square, chin trembling like a girl awaiting punishment. But the widow only reached for the pieces and said softly, it was just a cup. Mira nodded, but didn't speak. She never explained why that particular cup broke her. She understood it now. They sat together again. Weeks later, in that same kitchen, the tape between them. A small plastic case, scratched, faded. Mira's hands hovered over it like it still breathed. He came at midnight, Mira said. Her voice was made of dust and ash, left after 2. But he didn't come alone. The widow's fingers twitched. Toward the tape, then pulled back. Then who? Mira's silence was an answer. Or maybe a prayer. Outside, the garden was overgrown. Roses climbing the railing, ivy trying to choke the light. The house had not been cleaned since the reading of the second will. Since David had screamed across the courtroom, red-faced and sweating, that it was a forgery until the handwriting. Experts swore under oath it wasn't, but the photo hid something worse. In a dusty hallway drawer, tucked behind a mirror frame. The widow had found a photo of her husband and David, 20 years younger, arms around each other, both smiling. But there, at the edge, stood a girl. Brown eyes, thick braid. Barely 16. Mira. The widow slid the tape across the table. Why? Did you keep it? Myra looked up. Because he kept a promise. The story came out in pieces. Like the china cup. Mira's mother had once worked for David years before Mira ever stepped into the house. Quiet woman, cleaned offices. One day, a watch went missing. David said she took it. Police came. She was fired. But the watch reappeared 2 days later on. David's own wrist. He claimed it had been misplaced. Mira had never forgotten, and neither had her mother. But grief doesn't always become fire. Sometimes it turns to water, slow, creeping, relentless. The widow leaned forward. You think David killed him? I think, Mira said, he was trying to erase something. The widow reached for the tea kettle, her hands moving on their own. She didn't drink it. She only needed something to do. Something warm to hold in. The silence. A memory unfolded. Her husband at the garden table, weeks before he died. Sitting stiff, writing something. When she came out with lemonade, he covered the page too fast. She hadn't asked. She thought it was work. Or maybe a poem. It had been the second will. He looked up and said then, "There are debts I've never paid, and people I've never thanked." He'd smiled, but it hadn't reached his eyes. "This time I'll get it right." But the photo hid something worse. On the night of his death, the motion lights clicked on at 2:17 a.m. and again at 3:41, but only one face ever appeared on the original footage. David's. This tape, Myra's copy, showed two shadows moving down the hall, one tall, one smaller, limping. The widow blinked. He had help. Myra nodded. In court, David had said he came to confront his brother over a loan. But the widow knew her husband hadn't owed anyone anything. He'd sold an old car, cleared all debts. She had the receipts. One of them was still in her coat pocket, a torn yellow slip with his handwriting, echo motif. His writing, it was returning like a ghost, on the receipt, on the second will, on the unsent letter she'd found in the drawer that said simply, "If I die, blame my brother." But he didn't do it alone, the widow whispered now. No. Myra's gaze lowered. "And I think I know who." The name came in a whisper. A former employee. Fired last year, security. He knew the house. The blind spots. But this was no longer grief. It was something colder now, measured, sharp. The widow rose, walked into the hall. Her hand grazed the wallpaper, following the cracks like veins. She passed the study, past the photos, found herself outside the guest room, the one David used to stay in before the falling out. It still smelled faintly of his aftershave. Once, she had looked up to him, called him brother. Once, he had danced with her at her wedding. Love had turned to suspicion, pride to smallness. A reversal written not in words, but in deeds. When she returned to the kitchen, Myra had placed something beside the tape. A ring, her husband's. "I found it under the rug in the guest room," Myra said. After the funeral, it wasn't there. Before, that detail was quiet, but screamed. He never took off that ring. Not for showers, not for surgery. Not even when his hands swelled from arthritis. If it came off, it was by force. The widow picked it up, held it to the light. It bore a scratch across the inscription. Always E. She pressed it to her palm. A pressure point. "A vow returned." Myra asked softly, "What will you do?" The widow didn't answer right away. She stared at the steam rising from her untouched cup, the echo of warmth with nowhere to go. Then, he wanted the truth known. "We're going to finish what he started." Myra didn't smile, but her shoulders loosened. The widow looked at her then, not as help, but as witness, as protector, as the one person who had not run, not flinched, not stolen. She said, "Stay here. This house is yours now too." Myra flinched. "I don't." "It is not about need." The widow's voice softened. "It's about honor." Later, as she watched Myra clean the broken china pieces from a drawer, the ones neither of them had the heart to throw out, she realized. Some servants become the truest family. If justice still matters, you'll want the next page. She turned. The ring in her hand again. Light caught the scratch. But beneath it, the words still breathed. Always. She held it there until the steel burned warm, and the silence inside the house was no longer hollow, just waiting. Truth, when drawn by a child, is unfiltered. The house was quieter than usual, though not silent. The kind of quiet that carried memories in its breath. Not grief, not anymore, but the echo of it. On the far wall of the study, above the old desk still scuffed with her late husband's fingerprints, hung the drawing. Crayon on folded paper, framed in walnut and glass like it was sacred. A child's scrawl, the staircase, the grandfather clock, a red figure behind a blue one. Arms stretched, not holding, not catching, just pushing. Lily had drawn it with her head tilted, tongue poking from the side of her mouth in concentration. When she handed it over, she'd said, "So no one forgets what I saw." She hadn't, and neither had the widow. The sun barely touched. The edge of the desk, warming a half-empty mug and the corner of an open notebook. Her pen scratched slowly. Each word cost something. He told me once that justice was a mirror ugly but necessary. She set the pen down. It was her husband's. Heavy, brass, engraved with his initials. J.R.H., the same pen he used to sign both wills. She stared at the pen for a long while. Once, it had bought property, closed business deals, signed cards he forgot to write by hand. Now it was a relic or a weapon. Depending on how you looked at it. That morning, Lily had helped the maid rearrange the living room. Not with any real use, just carrying pillows and laughing when the maid turned on music from her phone. The girl danced with no rhythm and no shame, the way only the innocent could. It had taken the widow months to let sound back into the house. Music, laughter, even the rustle of newspapers had once felt like too much. Now the stillness unnerved her more. The crayon drawing hadn't always been in the study. It had lived in a drawer for weeks, folded between old utility bills and grief-soaked letters. But something changed after the verdict. After David's arrest, after the story spread her story, and strangers began sending notes, typed and handwritten, some angry, some grateful, some telling her about their own lost inheritances, secrets, the trails behind smiling family photos. But one envelope had arrived with no return address. Just a single sentence on a note card. Your granddaughter saved more than a legacy, she saved a lineage. But the photo hid something worse. She rose and walked to the window, watching Lily press flowers into the garden soil, her knees muddy, the maid showing her how to pat the earth gently like a secret. The same garden where her husband once walked. In long silences. The same path where David had shouted that day, veins pulsing in his neck. She'd watched from the upstairs window then, assuming it was about money. It always was. She'd been too proud to ask what it was really about. Pride had cost her clarity. Love had made her slow to suspect. And suspicion came too late. The study still smelled like hymn ink, cedar, something faintly metallic. She stepped back to the desk and touched the spine of the red leather journal. She hadn't opened it in weeks. Inside were pages of her own making now. Some letters to him, some to herself. A few to Lily for later years. When questions would bloom. She turned to a fresh page. The day I buried your grandfather, I didn't cry, not because I didn't want to, because I couldn't believe it had ended that way. Not him, not like that. Now I cry when Lily laughs. I cry when the floors creak in his rhythm. I cry when I see what he tried to fix before he died. She paused, hand trembling. Her husband hadn't been a perfect man, but in the end, he tried. That mattered. The flashback came without permission. The last time she saw him writing. Night, storm outside. His hand shaking as he pressed that same brass pen to paper. This time, he whispered, I'll get it right. And then the drawer shut. And so did the truth. Until the maid, with her silent loyalty and hidden bruises of her own, placed that second will in her hands like it might explode. The maid never asked for thanks. Only once had she spoken about the past, how her mother once cleaned the brother's estate, how she was dismissed over a missing brooch that later turned up on a mistress's wrist. Some debts, the maid said, don't need revenge. Just correction. The widow had nodded, unable to speak. Today, she'd asked the maid to stay. Not just for now, permanently. This house, she said, has ghosts, but they know your name. The woman had smiled then, eyes glassy. Then, I'll feed them too. Heartbeat. One of the letters from a stranger had said, sometimes justice feels like betrayal when it undoes the lies we needed to believe. She kept that one tucked into her journal's back flap. The widow walked back to the framed drawing. Her hand hovered over the glass. The red figure. The blue one. The empty staircase below. The drawing had been Lily's truth. Crude. Uncompromising. But clean. And the maid's silence that had been its own truth, too. Not cowardice, just calculation. Waiting for the right moment to reveal what she'd hidden. The widow had once believed family meant loyalty. She now understood it could also mean silence that rotted from the inside out. The pen rolled off the desk and hit the floor with a sharp clang. She bent to pick it up, but something stopped her. A memory, maybe. The maid had once said, "Some objects know when to fall." So she left it there, next to the rug's edge. A brass glint under sunbeam from the hallway. Lily's footsteps came. "Light skipping, Grandma?" she called. "In here," the widow said, voice steadier than she felt. The girl ran in, hair a mess, cheeks flushed. "I drew another one," Lily said, holding up a new picture. This time it was the garden. The maid and Lily planting something. A cat on the porch that didn't exist. Her, watching from the window. The widow smiled. "Can I keep this one too?" Lily nodded. "You can put it next to the first one." She turned and skipped off before she could see the way her grandmother's lips pressed tight. 2 drawings. One of truth. One of healing. She looked at the wall again, at the space beside the frame. Some echoes needed companionship. She took down the first drawing, opened the back, slipped the second one in behind it, like layering truth over grief. Or maybe the other way around. Then she hung it again. If justice still matters, you'll want the next page. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like hers. Healing doesn't erase pain, it rewrites it. The auditorium lights dimmed. And for a moment, all she could hear was the rustle of programs and the faint creak of old wood beneath restless feet. The widow sat in the 3rd row from the back, far from the stage, wrapped in a shawl she had knitted during her husband's trial. She touched the fabric now, the pattern imperfect where her hands had trembled most. In the dark, it looked like vines curled in on themselves, reaching, breaking, blooming. Lily was near the front, robed in navy, the cap slightly tilted, stubborn as ever about her hair. Her name would be called soon, Juris Doctor. The title still made the widow marvel. Not just because it was law, but because it had been born from truth, the kind that children aren't supposed to carry. And yet somehow 10 years ago, the girl had drawn a picture. Now she was drawing lines in courtrooms. She'd interned under names the widow only ever read in newspapers, clerked for a judge who said she saw straight through the fog. Lily had wanted to rewrite more than laws. She wanted to rewrite what people were told they had to accept. The widow clutched the envelope in her lap. Inside was a gift. A framed photo, one Lily had taken herself on film. The house bathed in golden evening light. The garden finely overgrown with deliberate care. Wild and free. But the photo hid something worse. Just inside the window, visible only if you knew to look, was a shadow, a woman's silhouette, watching. The maid had passed 2 years prior peacefully. But the widow had found herself calling out for her sometimes. In the kitchen, in dreams, especially when the nightmares came. Of stairs and thunder, and the silence that follows a pushed body. Her book had done well, not a bestseller. But it made its way through forums, support groups, late-night searches of estranged children and widowed spouses wondering why nothing added up. It was cited in one case in Ohio, another in Canada, and in 3 more states after that. She had called it the second will, but sometimes she wished she had named it Inheritance of Silence. One reviewer had written, "She doesn't write to accuse. She writes because the truth has nowhere else to live." Lily said the book had made her feel less alone. That was all the widow ever wanted. Heartbeat. The names were being read now. Applause rising, falling. She leaned slightly forward, knees aching, eyes scanning until she caught the sight of Lily's hands clasped tight in front of her. A nervous habit she'd had since childhood. She remembered Lily clutching a plastic lunchbox the day after the funeral. "If he comes back, I want to be ready." The widow had said nothing then. It took her months to say anything that mattered. She stood up when Lily's name was called. Not clapping, just rising, as if to meet the moment halfway. Lily looked out, caught her gaze, and smiled. That smile had changed everything once. Flashback. Her husband at the fireplace, holding the torn first will. He hadn't burned it, though he'd been close. "I need to fix this," he'd whispered. "I need to get it right this time." He didn't, but she had tried to finish what he started. The reception afterward was in a courtyard, students laughing over plastic flutes of sparkling cider and dreams. Lily moved through them with that careful way she had, poised but soft dash-eyed. The widow waited by a tree, away from the crowd. Her joints ached. Her heart ached more. Lily found her eventually. "You wore the shawl," she said. The widow nodded. "You wore your truth." They didn't hug, they just stood close. It was better that way, less fragile. Lily reached into her bag and pulled out a book. Worn, dog-eared. "I used it on my last case. It helped more than you know." The widow didn't respond. Her throat closed. Lily continued. "You wrote it so I wouldn't forget, but it helped me remember." Another heartbeat. The sky darkened slightly. Somewhere a bell rang. The widow turned toward the sound, then back. "You still draw?" she asked. Lily smiled, pulling a folded page from her pocket. "Crayon. Ink. Layers." The new drawing showed a woman at a desk, writing. Behind her, a child placing a frame on the wall. The house was full of color. "I don't frame the sad ones anymore," Lily said. "They sat on the bench," said Little. Across the courtyard, a student tripped and laughed it off. Her laughter reached them like light does, slow, but certain. The widow touched the edge of the shawl again. Once, she'd believed silence protected people. That swallowing grief was noble, but silence had nearly buried them all. Lily looked over. "You okay?" "No," she said honestly. "But I'm better. If justice still matters, you'll want the next page." She passed the torch to someone who sees clearly. History kept quiet until someone pressed play. The first tape arrived in a shoebox, wrapped in floral gift paper that smelled faintly of lavender. And cigarettes, no note. Just the soft clatter of plastic reels inside. An address from somewhere in Ohio. And her name written in looping cursive, as if the sender were scared to print it in bold. She let it sit on the kitchen table. For 3 days, Lily asked about it once. The maid said nothing but made tea with extra ginger. And the widow stared at it each time she passed, as if it might hiss or whisper or bleed. But on the 4th morning, before the kettle even boiled, she unwrapped it, held the tape in her hand. It was one of those old ones, clear body, black wheels. Handwritten label, 1977, house, birthday. When she slid it into the tape deck, an antique machine her husband had refused to throw away, the sound was dust-choked. But then a child laughed. Then another. Then a woman's voice said, "Don't go near the stairs, love." It wasn't her house. Not her children. Not her voice. But someone had sent her their memory. She listened to the whole thing, twice. Then she called the maid in. "We need a box," she said. "A large one." They started saving every envelope, every cassette, every letter. By the 3rd week, there were 17 tapes. By the 5th, there were 40-9. Some were stories. Others, confessions. One man's sister had vanished in 1983. Another woman wrote that her grandmother left behind a letter no one had dared open until she did after hearing the widow's podcast. The widow never meant to start a podcast. It had begun as a memoir, scribbled in fits across napkins, post-its, margins of unpaid bills. The working title. The second will. Her publisher pitched the podcast idea when he read the first chapter. "There's something here," he'd said. "It's not just your story, it's the shape of silence." The first episode went live on a cold Tuesday. She didn't promote it, didn't speak on it. It was just the sound of her reading, her voice tremoring through the truth she had lived. 57 plays. In the first day. 10,000 by the end of the week. But the photo hid something worse. People sent pictures too. Smudged Polaroids. Wedding. Snapshots with someone blacked out by pen. Birthdays with the wrong people missing. One woman mailed a baby photo, with a line of lipstick drawn across the child's cheek. The note read, "She kissed me after the slap." That's how I knew it was real. The widow didn't respond to every letter. She couldn't, but she saved every one in a fireproof box in the study, next to Lily's framed drawing, the one where David was pushing a stick figure with a cane. Her husband, her truth, their loss. The podcast kept growing. Episode 6 featured a redacted police report read by a woman whose father had died under mysterious household injuries. Episode 9 was an interview with a former nurse who had lost her license for reporting elder abuse. Sometimes, the nurse whispered, "You're punished for trying to save someone." But the broadcast revealed something deeper than pain. It built a quiet congregation, listeners who didn't just hear, but remembered. The widow became a name people whispered in hospital lobbies, in lawyer offices, in the dark corners of old kitchens. She said it, so maybe I can too. She began receiving invitations, speaking panels, TV spots. She turned them all down. Justice wasn't a spotlight. It was a steady hand, a patient ear. The maid watched it unfold with the kind of soft-eyed knowing that comes from generational silence. One night, she placed a small velvet pouch on the widow's desk. Inside was a ring, gold, dull with age. "My mother's," she said. David fired her for stealing. This was all she had left. The widow took the ring gently, held it in her palm. "Did she?" "No," the maid whispered. "But he made it feel true." And that was the trick, wasn't it? Not just the lie, but the weight of it. The way it shaped a woman's whole life. A quiet truth settled in the widow's chest that it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about cataloging the silenced, giving shape to what had been buried. Lily grew older. Drew less, but every now and then, the girl would trace her fingers along the edge of her framed drawing, tilt her head and say, "Grandpa would have liked my stories." The widow agreed, but the tape in her hand told a different story. It was labeled only 4:32 a.m. She hesitated. Heart clicking against her ribs, pressed play, a man's voice. Not her husband's. You couldn't make out the words at first, just pacing. A door creaking. Then, "Don't let her find it." Another voice, shaken. "It's done. She won't." He made sure. The sound of something being dragged. A chair? A body? She stopped the tape. Set it aside. Not all truths were hers to tell, not yet, but she labeled that one. Tucked it in a separate drawer. For later. There was still so much more to hear. If justice still matters, you'll want the next page. She was silenced once, but now she listens for a living. She remembered the night he fell, not the thud, not the sirens, but the stillness. Afterward, the way the grandfather clock had stopped ticking, as if time refused to witness what followed. Now, the hallway echoed with a quieter rhythm. Her own footsteps. She moved slowly, hands grazing along wallpaper once chosen by someone else's taste. The estate had stopped apologizing for its silence. The air no longer carried accusation, only memory. In the drawing room, sunlight filtered through half-scrubbed windows. Lily's framed drawing hung above the fireplace now, its stick figure honesty both naive and damning. The child had drawn what no one dared speak, and in doing so, read through the family. She traced the edge of the frame. The crayon lines were beginning to fade, but she had them memorized, the curved stairs, the tiny man with his hands raised, the shadow behind him larger than life. Children tell the truth with colors. Adults spend lifetimes hiding in courtrooms. Had begun with a second will. A single envelope that split a dynasty in two. But what followed was far messier. Forgiveness rationed like sugar in wartime. grief curling like smoke in the walls, and justice that didn't roar it, whispered. She no longer searched for ghosts. But she sometimes paused when the floor creaked, when a door clicked shut too softly, wondering if memory had masked out the wedding ring still pressed into her finger, thinner now, the gold worn smooth by years of repetition. She hadn't removed it, not when they read the will, not when they lowered the casket, not when David was sentenced. But today, she felt its weight differently, not as tether, as release. She stepped into the study. The smell was familiar, old. Paper, lemon polish, ink. The same desk, but now cleared of secrets. Her manuscript rested there, spine cracked from edits, a title etched across the top page. The second will. Sometimes she read it out loud at night. To no one. To him. In the bottom drawer, tucked beneath old receipts and a faded handkerchief, lay the cassette tape, the original. The one the maid had hidden in a flour tin. The one that captured footsteps, voices, a door opening at the wrong hour. She held it in her palm. It was lighter than expected. But then again, so was truth. There had been someone else in the house, but that person had been wearing soft-soled shoes and walked like they didn't want to be heard. The tape didn't reveal a name, only an outline. A ghost that justice couldn't indict. She'd let it go. Some wars are won not by exposure, but by survival. There was a time she would have hunted. The last thread chased every echo. But Lily had started sleeping through the night. The maid, now a tenant, now a friend, played piano again in the afternoons. And the house had stopped bracing itself. She was tired of bleeding for people who wouldn't admit they'd wounded her. Outside, the garden had bloomed wild. She didn't prune it like before. She let it climb, spill, wander. There was a beauty in mess now. Once, she'd watched her husband from the kitchen window, his back always straight, his gestures restrained. He had been raised not to flinch, not to cry, not to fail. She saw it now, how much that cost him. He had written the second will with a shaking hand, not from age, from fear. This time, he whispered, holding her hand tight, I'll get it right. He had, just not soon enough to save himself. She walked the upstairs hallway, past closed doors and half-filled shelves. The nursery still had Lily's drawings taped to the closet. A flower with too many petals. A heart with a crack down the middle. But the photo hid something worse. Tucked behind the picture frame of her wedding day was an envelope she'd never dared open, addressed in her husband's hand. For when it's too quiet to pretend, she'd kept it there for months, untouched. Today, she opened it. Inside was a single photograph. The two of them at the garden party years ago. He had been mid-laugh. She was looking at him, not the camera. On the back, he had written, You always saw me, even when I couldn't. She sat on the edge of the bed, the letter trembling in her lap. He had known. About David. About the money. About the silence it would buy. But he had also known her. She rose, walked barefoot down the stairs, across the hallway, and out into the light. The air was softer. August wind, thick with rosemary and honeysuckle. Reached the gate. The iron had rusted in places, but it still held. Her hand trembled slightly as she took off the ring. Held it a moment, then slid it over the tallest post. Not goodbye. Not regret. Closure. She turned back toward the house. Windows open, piano playing. She waited. And in the end she healed.